The road to Wraith Hollow was swallowed by fog, the kind that clings to glass and whispers against the windows like fingertips tracing words you can't quite read. Clara parked her car where the dirt path vanished into the mist and stared ahead. There it was, the house. But its frame leaned ever so slightly, as though gravity had been tugging at it for decades, yet it refused to fall. The windows were opaque with dust, the wood swollen with age and dampness. And the front door, solid oak, chained and sealed, stood like a tombstone marking the grave of something that should have never been buried. The road leading into Wraith Hollow seemed to stretch longer the deeper Clara drove, as if the town didn't want to be found. The world beyond her headlights had turned into a dull smear of grey, and even the trees looked like silhouettes trapped in mid-breath. She had studied the map, traced the path dozens of times, but now the road beneath her seemed unfamiliar, an unmarked artery pulsing into nowhere. Her phone had long lost its signal, and the silence that filled the car was unnerving. No birds, no crickets, only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of gravel under her tires. When the fog thickened into a wall, she stopped. Ahead, through the milky haze, she could just make out the crooked outline of the house she'd been chasing across whispers and forgotten archives. The stories had always described it differently. Some said the Harrow house was burned, others said it was swallowed by the earth, but there it stood, defying both ruin and memory. Its silhouette rose from the ground like a wound that refused to heal. The upper windows were black and hollow, staring out at her like blind eyes. She stepped out of the car, boots crunching on the wet soil, and the air hit her, cold and metallic, carrying the faint scent of rotten old rain. The mist coiled around her ankles as she approached the gate that hung lopsided from a single hinge, its metal moaning softly in the wind. Each step closer seemed to thicken the quiet. The house looked larger than it should have been, as though distance obeyed different laws here. The wooden panels were warped and swollen, streaked with the scars of time, and yet there was a strange strength in its decay, an unspoken defiance that dared anyone to come closer. Clara could almost hear her own heartbeat echoing off the front porch. The chains looped around the front door glistened faintly, the metal damp but unbroken, as though someone had polished them recently. That detail unsettled her more than anything else, the notion that time hadn't simply stopped here, but had been preserved deliberately, watched over. Clara lifted her camera, the lens catching the faint shimmer of condensation on the windows. For an instant, she thought she saw movement behind one of them, the briefest flicker of light, like a candle snuffed out before it could breathe. She blinked and it was gone. The fog pressed tighter around the house now, closing her in. Somewhere deep inside, something was waiting. Inside the Harrow house, the air was colder than it had any right to be, thick with the scent of mildew and something older, something that clung to the lungs like dust soaked in sorrow. Clara's flashlight cut through the dark, the beam quivering across faded wallpaper that peeled like ancient skin. The silence was oppressive, swallowing the faint echo of her footsteps as she moved deeper inside. Her boots brushed against fragments of glass and wood, remnants of furniture that had collapsed under the weight of years. Everything felt frozen, as if the house had inhaled once, long ago, and never exhaled again. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost mistook it for her imagination. A steady, rhythmic ticking, far away yet distinct enough to pierce through the stillness. She followed it through the corridor, her light sweeping over portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, their expressions locked in mournful stares. The ticking grew louder as she reached a grand staircase, the kind that belonged to a place that once knew laughter and warmth. Now it stood draped in cobwebs, its banister cold and damp beneath her gloved hand. The sound came from a room at the end of the hall, behind a half-open door. She pushed it gently, and it creaked in protest, the sound echoing down the corridor like a sigh. There, in the center of the room, stood a tall grandfather clock. Its wooden frame was cracked and warped, but its pendulum still swung with methodical grace, untouched by decay. Clara approached cautiously, her breath visible in the dim light. There was no power, no reason for it to be running, yet the ticking was impossibly steady. She knelt beside it, feeling the faint vibration of the mechanism through the floorboards. The clock's glass face was intact, but behind it, she thought she saw movement, a shimmer, like light bending underwater. As the pendulum swung, a faint whisper rose with it, timed perfectly with each tick. It was not words at first, only a murmur, but gradually the rhythm formed a pattern, syllables barely audible but undeniably human. Clara froze, her heart racing. It was as if the clock was breathing secrets, speaking in a voice older than the house itself. She turned off her flashlight for a moment, letting the darkness settle, and listened. The whispers grew clearer, curling through the air like smoke, and somewhere among them, she thought she heard her name. Clara's trembling hand steadied the flashlight as she backed away from the clock, its ticking now echoing in her chest like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She needed air, movement, anything to break the suffocating stillness pressing against her skull. The hallway seemed longer now, the wallpaper more warped, the shadows darker, stretching like veins beneath the weak beam of her light. Her breath fogged the air as she turned a corner into what must have once been a parlor. The heavy curtains hung limp and brittle, their edges disintegrating into dust when she brushed against them. A large mirror dominated one wall, framed in ornate gold that had tarnished to greenish black, its surface veiled in grime thick enough to hide the world behind it. Instinct made her draw closer, curiosity wrestling with the warning that hummed at the back of her mind. She wiped the surface with her sleeve, smearing the dust into streaks, and froze. The reflection did not show her, not exactly. The room was the same, the collapsed furniture, the faded rug, but in the mirror, the air shimmered faintly, and figures began to form. A man, tall and rigid, dressed in clothing from another century. A woman beside him, her hands clutching something close to her chest. And behind them, two children, motionless, their faces pale and drawn. They stood in silence, their eyes hollow, fixed on something out of frame. Clara blinked, certain it was a trick of light, but when she lifted her flashlight to the mirror, the figures flinched, their movements slow and deliberate, like old films struggling to play. Her pulse spiked. She turned her head to the real room, empty. But when she looked back into the mirror, the family was still there, closer now, their faces more defined, fear etched into every line. The man's mouth moved, but no sound came. The woman's eyes widened as if she were silently pleading, her reflection trembling as though trapped behind invisible glass. The children pressed their hands against the inside of the mirror, their palms leaving faint, fogged impressions that began to spread outward, forming cracks that spiderwebbed across the surface. Clara stumbled backward as the air around her grew colder, the temperature plunging sharply. The whispering from the clock returned, threading through the stillness, growing louder, almost frantic. She lifted the flashlight again, and for one fleeting second, she saw her own reflection among them, standing with the same empty eyes, the same terrified expression, before the glass rippled and went dark once more. The house had grown restless, its silence no longer still but breathing, pulsing faintly as if aware of her presence. Clara stood in the middle of the parlor, her flashlight beam flickering weakly, the battery threatening to die. The mirror had gone dark again, but its surface seemed to hum softly, vibrating with a rhythm that matched the pendulum's distant ticking. The floor beneath her feet creaked, not from her movement, but as though something below was shifting. She turned toward the hallway, intent on leaving, yet the path she'd entered from was gone. In its place stretched another corridor, narrower, longer, slanted ever so slightly, leading to a door that hadn't been there before. Her stomach knotted. The air grew thicker, the smell of damp wood and metal filling her nose as she took an uncertain step forward. The house was rearranging itself, folding like an old memory trying to remember how it once was. Every step made the boards groan louder. The walls seemed to draw closer, the floral wallpaper fading into patterns that resembled veins. Clara tried to keep her breathing steady, counting under her breath, but the sound of her own heartbeat was drowned out by the low groan of the structure itself. She could feel the vibration in her ribs, in her teeth, as though the house was trying to speak through its bones. The door at the end of the corridor loomed larger with each step, its frame twisted, the wood unnaturally dark. It was the same design as the one at the front of the house, the same chains, the same marks where something had once clawed against it. Only this one wasn't sealed. Its handle gleamed faintly in the dim light, a wet shimmer that made her skin crawl. She reached for it slowly, her hand trembling despite her effort to remain still. As her fingers brushed the cold metal, the walls shuddered violently. A sound rose from deep within the house, a deep, guttural groan that felt alive. The wallpaper split in places, dust cascading down like ash. She stumbled backward as the door began to thrum with energy, a faint heartbeat pulsing through it. The sound was followed by another, a dragging noise, heavy and deliberate, like something immense waking from sleep. Clara's flashlight died completely, plunging her into darkness. For a moment there was nothing but her own ragged breathing and the echo of that pulse. Then, in the pitch black, the door began to breathe with her, in rhythm, exhaling cold air that smelled of soil and decay. The darkness pressed around her like a living thing, thick and heavy, swallowing every sound except the steady pulse of the door. Clara's body trembled as she reached into her pocket for the spare battery, her fingers slipping against the cold metal. The moment the flashlight flickered back to life, she realized the hallway behind her was gone. The house had sealed her in. The walls now curved inward, the ceilings sagging like damp fabric, and faint outlines of faces seemed to move beneath the wallpaper, eyes opening, mouths forming shapes of silent screams. She stumbled backward until her shoulders met the trembling door, its surface unnervingly warm against her spine, the rhythm of its heartbeat syncing with her own. The whispers returned, louder now, spilling from the cracks in the walls, overlapping voices filled with confusion, pleading, warning. They weren't trying to frighten her. They were trying to keep her from opening it. Her camera dangled from her neck, the red recording light blinking faintly. The voices grew frantic as she raised her flashlight to the door, the beam revealing faint carvings in the wood, initials, names, hundreds of them, etched over one another in desperation. Near the bottom, a fresh set of letters gleamed through the dust, her own name. Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't been here before, yet the house knew her. The truth hit her in fragments. Every explorer who came searching for answers had left something of themselves behind, a piece absorbed into the architecture, their curiosity feeding whatever the house had become. The whispers weren't ghosts of the dead, they were echoes of the living who had tried to understand and failed. The pulse quickened beneath her hand, the wood flexing like muscle. The air thinned, her lungs burning as the temperature dropped. Her instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The house wanted her to open it, to see what lay beyond. Maybe it was freedom. Maybe it was the end. Clara's thoughts blurred as a sharp ringing filled her ears, drowning out the whispers until only one voice remained, a faint, calm murmur, repeating her name with unsettling familiarity. The handle turned on its own, slowly, as if inviting her to finish what had been waiting a century to begin. She hesitated for one final breath, caught between terror and the insatiable pull of curiosity, the same force that had brought her here, the same that had trapped them all.